In the first episode, we visited the ruins on the south side of the River Tees at Cliffe, North Yorkshire, which were excavated by Peter Scott in 1972. Scott concluded that these were the remains of a second Roman bridge, which had been built to replace an earlier crossing. Scott's reasoning was that the Tees is a spate river, and he believed that the first Roman bridge had been destroyed in a catastrophic flood. To prevent a reoccurrence, he proposed that the Romans built the second bridge further downstream in the floodplain, and then diverted Deer Street to the new crossing. We also explained how Raymond Selkirk had visited Cliffe and perceived the remains to be those of a Roman dam or weir, which had stretched across the Tees to feed a navigation canal on the north bank. In Selkirk's view, the construction of a weir enabled Piercebridge to develop as a Roman port and entrepot. In Selkirk's opinion, the first Roman bridge was never destroyed in the catastrophic flood and remained in use throughout the Roman period. Finally, in part 1, local amateur archaeologist Bill Trow explained how the remains at Cliffe had been misinterpreted by Scott and subsequently by others. In particular, Bill pointed out that the so-called abutment has no wing walls and is too small to support a bridge. Furthermore, he suggested there is no evidence that Piers 1 and 2 ever existed. Similarly, the presence of a Lewis hole in the alleged cutwater stone at the site of Pier 3 suggests it wasn't an outward-facing block. Finally, the inscribed stones found at what is referred to as Pier 4 are not the base for a pier, but the foundation for a dam wall. Thus, after a pleasant lunch at the George Hotel, we reconvened in the Toffs Field to explore Carlbury Vale.
Yeah, we're now in the Toffs Field, and the fort was just over there, in front of the church, the side of the church, earlier on today. We're at the point where Deer Street would have crossed the River Tees by a wooden bridge across here. The divers put in by Ray Selkirk into the river there originally were to identify that the river was at the same level as it always has been, and it hadn't cut a deeper channel like what archaeologists were trying to claim in the past. So the river level now is the same. There's timbers in there at the same level, and they've also found something like 3,700 Roman finds in there, which a report was written on last year, and unfortunately I had problems trying to identify why a lot of these finds were in a clear concretion when this is a spate river and there shouldn't be any clear actually in that area. When I say unfortunately, it was unfortunately because they talked about a curious account by Ray Selkirk of the possibility of a bridge, a dam downstream, because that dam would have flooded the river back under the Deer Street Bridge, and that would have silted up in times, and anything that was thrown from the bridge would have landed in the silt and eventually became a bit of a clear substance which preserved them in that spot in a spate river. And the conclusion was that there was a couple of possible reasons why that clay was in that particular position. Was that there was either shoals of gravel downstream blocking the river, or there was some sort of artificial barrier. And it's just a pity the author hadn't read the Piercebridge formula, and that would have given him the answer. One other thing is they identified the structure that we've just looked at on the south of the river as a bridge, because when they looked at Deer Street here, it had 4 different phases, and the first 2 looked very military precision, and the last 2 were very poor by comparison. So they thought this bridge here, which has Roman finds for the whole period, had been washed away or destroyed, And between the second level of road and the third, they identified when that had gone out of use, and that they said was 180, right? But that couldn't be, because we've looked at the reports in Bowes Museum, and we found that there was a piece of, or some pieces of coarse pottery on that road that dated 180 to 240, and you can't give that 180 as a date for that road going out of use.
It is important to emphasise that when Scott excavated Deer Street in 1974, his aim was to see if the road had fallen out of regular use during the Roman period. If he could prove that it had, then it would support his hypothesis that Deer Street had been diverted towards a new bridge at Cliffe. Furthermore, any finds might help him to date when this had occurred. Scott published his initial findings in the Durham Gazette in 1975. Here he described how Deer Street and the Toss Field had evolved over time and was actually comprised of 4 roads, one built on top of the other. However, only the first 2 roads were of what he called a military standard, whilst the later levels were referred to as unsupervised civilian work. The supposed inferior quality of the later roads now led him to claim that the route through the Toffs Field must have become less important during the Roman period. In this article he suggested that the last remetalling of Deer Street had taken place around 200 AD, with the diversion to a second crossing occurring sometime around 220 AD. In 1982, Scott reassessed his findings and changed his timing of events. To support his hypothesis that there had been a second Roman bridge, he now sought to tie the supposed decline of Deer Street in the Toss Field to the rise of the southern vicus, which appeared to have been founded in the mid-2nd century to accommodate the building workers at Cliffe, whom Scott presumed had built the second bridge. To obtain an earlier date, he now proposed that Deer Street in the Toss Field had fallen out of regular use at some point between the completion of the second road and the construction of the third. Scott claimed this gave a date range of 130 to 180 AD for the destruction of the first Roman bridge, which now aligned its demise to the development of the southern vicus. Although based almost entirely upon conjecture, Scott's hypothesis is still widely accepted today. Scott never published a detailed account of his work at Piercebridge. Sadly, he passed away in 1987. It's probably fair to say that he was always prepared to entertain alternative views and was careful to present his own thoughts as a hypothesis. However, he never seems to have doubted that he had found the remains of a second Roman bridge. In 2008, Cooler Mason published a report based on Scott's excavation notes, which had been deposited in the Bowes Museum. More details now emerged about his dig in the Toffs Field, with the dating evidence and the way it had been presented coming under greater external scrutiny. In particular, the pottery found on the surface of the second road showed that the third road had probably been laid sometime between 180 and 240 AD. The implication was that Scott had used the earliest possible date in his 1982 report to support his hypothesis that Deer Street had fallen out of use at the same time as the southern vicus began to develop. Taking a mid-range date would have shown that there was no such correlation. Scott also used terms such as military standard and unsupervised civilian work when considering Deer Street, which could be construed as misleading. Scott applied the latter phrase to denigrate the quality of the third and fourth roads and to imply that their composition was inadequate to support traffic on a main thoroughfare. However, Roman roads come in different shapes and forms, and there may have been a good reason for using a looser aggregate in the later stages of Deer Street's development, especially as the earlier roads would have provided a firm foundation. Overall, it may have been better if Scott had given greater attention to Deer Street's evolution as a road within its own landscape. His focus was on obtaining dating evidence, and less thought was given to how the natural topography or the growth of the northern vicus may have affected the road's development. A broader approach may have provided a better insight into why several resurfacings of Deer Street were necessary. Scott tried to build up his hypothesis into a more robust theory, but as time has progressed, the evidence has stubbornly refused to support his concept of 2 Roman bridges and a rerouting of Deer Street. Thus, the finds recovered from the river at the site of the first Roman bridge suggest it remained in use throughout the Roman period, and probably beyond. In this picture you can see a fragment of a florid cruciform brooch which was retrieved from the riverbed at the site of the first Roman bridge. Philippa Walton has dated this artefact to the 6th century. Numerous coins and other items have also been recovered at the same location, which date to the 3rd and 4th centuries. Eckhart and Walton conclude that a significant proportion of the finds recovered from the Tees were deposited directly into the river for ritualistic purposes. Thus it is hard to believe that the first bridge was destroyed in the catastrophic flood before 180 AD, as Scott proposes. It is also worth noting that no significant finds have been found at the supposed site of the second bridge, which indicates it was more likely to have been a weir, as Raymond Selkirk suggested.
Yeah, we've just come out the Topsfield and I mentioned about a couple of roads that were heading along to this direction. And Raymond Selkirk, he thought that the mill races were more than likely Roman canals originally, and the millers just simply used them. He came down here and he had a look, and this is a mill race. In here it runs to the corn mill, which is further down the side. He identified some stonework in this, so I decided I would have a dig in there, an excavation in there, to try and find out at what depth the mill race was originally. That was the site of our first dig. Yes, Selkirk showed a photograph in the Piercebridge formula of stonework in here that had slots in, which looked as if it was a lock gate or a sluice gate. And that was only about 4 foot away from there. It was about this position. We did another dig in here. This is one of the stones where we did our first dig, and this was the height of it. We excavated down here. We did intend to excavate along the full width of the trench, but when we found out what depth we were going to go to, we had to abandon that, and we just did a small dig at this end, and we found that the stonework was 7'3" lower than this, which is 2.3 meters, I think it is. That stonework was 2.3 meters high. The base of the structure was paving stones, crazy paving. The stonework actually went down below the crazy paving, down the side, but the crazy paving had been laid beforehand. Afterwards, sorry. At the other side, we were defeated by tree roots, but this is down below here where we did the excavation, and we found that the width between the structure was 13'6". 13'6" for a mill race to work one wheel. It seems a bit much.
So do you think these stone structures would have continued all the way down this
well, we assumed that at first, but we found that they didn't.
Right.
Because we did another dig down there.
Yeah.
And I'll explain to that shortly.
Okay.
We did another dig, this other dig that we did here where the slots were. we thought that was where there'd been possibly a lock gate.
This video clip is a record of Northern Archaeology Group's original dig in October 2016. You can see that there are several courses of stonework, as well as flags at the bottom of the canal. The substantial nature of the structure is self-evident, which infers it is unlikely to have been built as a mill race to service a single wheel at Carlbury Mill. The stonework and depth of the canal can be seen more clearly in this photograph. The measuring rod shows that it is 2.3 metres deep. A further trench was subsequently cut alongside Trench 1 to find the slot mentioned by Raymond Selkirk. It is believed that this aperture held a post which supported some kind of lifting device, which may have been designed to prevent floodwater entering the canal, but could also form part of a Roman lock.
You may notice in some of our photographs, we had a surveyor here taking levels at the time, and we took a level of the base in there and we compared it with the level of Pier 4 base on the structure to the south, which was a spillway, and that would have been the level of the water behind the dam, and that would have put 902 millimetres of water, about 3 foot, into the structure. That's enough to sail a boat. So in that respect, if this was a canal and that was a dam, it would work perfectly.
I think one of the things to mention in this context, Bill, is that they found a Barland's farm boat, didn't they, in Somerset, which was an estuarine boat, and that had a draft of 0.45 metres.
Yes.
So something like that could easily have got into the canal.
Yeah, it was a boat that worked estuary. It'll have been a bigger boat than would have been used here.
Right.
And it all goes on how much supplies are needed as to the size of the boat and also the size of the river.
Right.
It's horses for courses, really.
Yeah.
You know, the evidence points towards further upstream at the other side of Piercebridge that they've gone further on with smaller boats again.
Right. Yeah.
We did a dig down here in the mill race. It wasn't as deep as the other one. It was only about 1,500 deep, I think. But what we found was the natural limestone rock strata had been cut to a depth of, I think it was 450 millimetres, 18 inches roughly. It had been cut to a depth and level along the bottom for 10 foot wide. So there was a rock cut channel 10 foot wide along the bottom. The sides had been revetted with very large cobbles which had been cut to fit into the natural rock, and from there the slope was revetted up with smaller cobbles. So we didn't have the width that we've got upstream, about 400 metres upstream, and there may be a reason for that, which we possibly discuss a little bit later.
In this picture you can see the rock cut channel and the cobbles set in clay which formed the embankment. The large cobbles have been moved from their original position above the limestone strata. This image shows the base of the canal. Its width to this point was just over 3 metres, or 10 feet. This picture shows how the heavier cobbles found in the canal may have fitted into grooves cut into the top of the limestone strata. Again, such workmanship indicates that the structure was built as a canal and not as a mill race.
Right, here we're further along the mill race. It's at this point that I believe the Roman canal had left this mill race, and this section here was excavated at a later time, because that house over there on the 1860 Ordnance Survey map was called the Old Mill House. So it's quite possible that there was a mill there and they've simply connected up to the tail race of that mill, which becomes the Piercebridge Beck. The thing is, we did a levelling survey and we took levels of the beck where the mill race connected to it, and we found that it was almost 4 foot higher than what the base of our canal was, and that doesn't make sense. The mill race could have only been excavated to put water into the beck, and that as it stands is far too high in relation to what's being dug out.
I think this is quite important, Bill, because I think this is where a lot of the criticism comes out from the archaeologists.
Yes.
Which is the relationship between the canal and the beck.
Yes.
So we're saying here the base of the canal is how much lower, did you say?
It's almost 4 foot lower.
4 foot lower. So we have to imagine that in the past the canal would actually have carried on and there'd be no connection here at this point.
No connection to the Piercebridge Beck as we know it.
Right.
But I believe the Piercebridge Beck actually flowed through here originally. And there was a mill pond constructed which blocked that off on the other side of the river. And that may have been a Roman structure.
So we've got sort of possibly various sort of periods of...
You have, and some of the evidence I've found since, just this year, points to this area here being a Roman mill.
Right.
In which case the Romans, the Piercebridge Beck over there was actually the mill race,
right,
and the tail race out of the mill.
Yeah.
And this section here used the old course of the beck, which in turn runs down here, and you can see the groove going through the field down there, and that would have been the line of the Roman canal.
So you have to forget any connection between the canal and the beck at this point.
Yes.
They're completely separate entities.
The Romans would have used an old course of the beck, which was under here.
Yeah. Right. And just dug it deeper, perhaps?
Well, more than likely, because I mean
the water levels.
They could rock away further up. This old course, or the canal, joins the beck a little bit lower than what its confluence appears to be, and it's at that height that we found that the levels corresponded with our dig in the mill race, to prove that there'd be a level course of water all the way through there. It then goes in turn down to the Carlbury Vale, which again has very large mill race and tail race, much larger than what's necessary.
Would it have been straighter over time?
The chances are would, you have cattle grazing and what have you, pushing soil down in one place and maybe taking it out in another. And I have probed in it, and I've probed down the full length of the probe without touching anything, so the bed of that is pretty low down.
What have we got here then, Bill?
Well, this is the site of where the Roman dam, I believe, or the bridge would have crossed the river. There's not much sign of it. Just down here there is Roman stones in the river with Roman features on. But there isn't much to see. Down there now is the natural rock strata under the river.
Bob Middlemass and Rolf Mitchinson were the divers who recovered the Roman artefacts from the riverbed at the site of the first Roman bridge. However, this diagram from 2001 is a record of the stones they found in the river and in the north bank, opposite the structures excavated by Peter Scott in 1972. It is argued here that these stones were not part of a second Roman bridge, but represent the remains of a weir and its northern abutment, which once stretched across the Tees.
There's a depression in here, going along here.
Whereabouts is it, Bill? So am I standing at the other end?
Yes, that's about it.
So It's quite a big trench then.
Yeah, they dug a trench across here to see if they could find the remains of the road or the bridge here, and there's no signs of it. They said it's probably been washed away like it has been on the other side.
Soon after finding the masonry structures at Cliffe, Scott looked for the remains of a bridge on the north bank of the Tees. As we have seen, this search proved fruitless. Scott also sought to find a road which he thought connected the southern vicus to the southern abutment, but in a report in the Durham Gazette in 1973, he stated that he could find no trace and observed that any remains had probably been removed by the graders. Scott also tried to confirm that Deer Street had been rerouted by looking for its presence on the north bank. In his 1982 report, he declared without any supporting evidence that the road had been found during the digging of a sewerage trench in Carlbury Vale. It wasn't until Cool and Mason published Scott's notes in 2008 that any further information came to light. However, from the details given, which had basically been obtained from a watching brief, it seemed more likely that Scott had seen the remains of a road which is known to exist, that runs east from the fort. In this picture, its route would have been along the high ground, towards and then running beneath the houses. It seems unlikely, therefore, that the road Scott observed was a diversion of Deer Street, especially as it would have needed to pass through the floodplain of the Piercebridge beck in order to return to the main thoroughfare. Scott's working hypothesis that he had found a bridge was not an unreasonable stance. However, Selkirk's alternative view that the ruins exposed in 1972 were part of a weir and port complex seems more credible following the excavations in the mill race, which appears to have been a Roman canal. Scott was never able to make the firm connections that would make his hypothesis work. Thus he never found the northern abutment and piers to a second Roman bridge, and was unable to prove that Deer Street had been rerouted, or indeed that the first Roman bridge had ever fallen out of use. To conclude, it's time for archaeologists to step back and have another look at Roman Piercebridge, for it may provide a fascinating insight into Roman Britain.